Enjoy a seat at the table and good company, where great conversations and meaningful discussions happen.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sarah Fiedelholtz. We all know a great dinner party isn't really about the food. It's about the people seated around the table engaging in lively discussions. And Good Company gives you a seat at the table to enjoy smart and interesting conversations as they happen. I am so pleased to be in the company of Andrew Gritzmaker, who is the CEO for Habitat for Humanity in Greater Fort Wayne, Zach Benedict, who is the principal, or a principal, at MKM Architecture and Design, Heather Presley Cowan, who is the CEO and founder of Your Housing Resource and Club 720, and Andrew Hoffman, who is the Director of Marketing for Synapis, and, is that right?
You got it.
Okay, and the former Executive Director for Neighborhood Link. Welcome. So, what we are going to really unfold is this whole, we're not going to even tackle probably a little piece of it, but it's the whole housing crisis that we are facing. And I thought very carefully of who I wanted to have at this table for this really important discussion, because this housing crisis is really at an epidemic proportion on the national, regional, and city level. And I wanted to sort of, before we start, give you how I see each of you. So Zach, as an architect and really who I believe is my Renaissance thinker, you're all thought leaders and you're all innovative. So that was the easy box to check. But Zach, you really are a visionary and the problem solver, and I think you really present a holistic approach to solutions. And then Heather, you really are a policy maker, you're a program creator, and you really are the solutions provider. So you really put your money where your mouth is. Andrew Hoffman, in your position, former position with Neighborhood Link, you really were this boots on the ground expert and really saw individual one-on-one the needs and what the lack of affordable housing or income causes for people. And we also talked about some of the other ideas based on that work. You're being more of forward thinking, sure, and even thinking of ways that you can use your skill set and now your new position to possibly create new ways of thinking about housing or building housing. And Andrew Gritzmaker, you oversee a nonprofit that is a time-tested, tangible solution. But you also, I think, really have done what people, I would call that true out-of-the-box thinking, where you've taken a traditional approach to solving a problem and really have turned it on its head to really look at the issues of financing, not only for your clients, but for you as a nonprofit. And so what I'm hoping is that all of you will bring all of that and more to this conversation. So of course, as you all know, because you've been at this table before, so I do research to sort of think about and frame the problem. And I have to admit that when I began to think about the housing crisis, I felt like there was so much to unpack. And there were so many issues and challenges that have an impact on the housing issues that you don't even realize. Like, it's not just a solution of building more houses. That's not going to solve the problem. And I really wanted to understand this issue because it's not about trying to put just roofs over people's heads and giving them a safe place to live. There is so much more to this issue. And so I really would like to frame our conversation because the issue of housing is so big. But I'd like to frame what we're going to talk about in terms of looking at affordable housing. So the first thing I need to ask each of you is how do you define affordable housing? But I also need I'm going to start with Heather, because I need an understanding of what is the difference between what public housing, Section 8 housing, voucher housing, and then you can tell me what your definition is of affordable housing.
Okay, so I oftentimes refer to it as big A affordable housing and little a affordable housing. So starting with the easy one, little a affordable housing has to be affordable to you. So if I can afford to buy a home and afford to live in that home or live in that home affordably, then it's affordable. So in a sense, we all live in affordable housing. But big A affordable housing is when we start to get into the publicly subsidized housing. So, there is public housing, which is run by public housing authorities. Much of that is being transitioned to a more private sector model right now, in a modernizing it. But you also have Section 8 vouchers, which means I can afford to pay so much of the rent, and a landlord is willing to accept my voucher so that the government can pay the rest. But there's also low-income housing tax credits, which is known as rental housing tax credits, another form of affordable, big A, affordable housing, where we set the incomes at the level that the government wants to see fulfilled, and the private sector gets to invest in those projects and receive benefits for that in order to create more affordable housing. So then those individuals who come and want to rent are measured by their income first and their ability to pay. So there's a lot more that I could talk about in that, but when the government gets involved, oftentimes we start to put limits on income in some way, form, or fashion, and the private sector is encouraged to participate.
And Andrew, how would you define affordable housing?
Well, in the same way, I think for much of my experience over the last 13 years working with fixed income homeowners, many of them were able to afford their housing. They were able to buy their house, pay their house off, or be at the end of their term. But along the way, they landed at a fixed income, often $800 to $1,200 a month. They were working class. They invested their time and energy, and what they receive in a Social Security benefit is designed, or supposed to be designed, to help them continue to live independently in the home that they invested in. Yet it was rarely, if ever, enough to cover their basic needs and afford to maintain the upkeep. And so many of them were at a position of transition in life, and with their housing yet lacked options. So affordable housing becomes much different to them in terms of barely being able to afford to upkeep the housing that they already have in many ways, yet not enough to transition to some other housing where the housing is not quite right for them. So very much in the same context as what Heather's described, just in a different context.
And Zach?
I have the luxury of not having to deal with big A as much as Heather does. Affordable housing, in some ways, in our work, is available resources divided by cost needs to be greater than 1. The difference is how you quantify what the costs are. So it can be rent, but you're also dealing with insurance, healthcare, access to everyday goods and services, transportation, quality of life. Then that cost equation gets a lot more complicated. So when we're dealing with affordable, sometimes in partnership with other groups, is trying to understand how we can best and most responsibly define the totality of those costs. And I don't think it can just be a mortgage or a rent, which I think for a couple generations, that's how we thought about it.
And Andrew?
Well, at Habitat, we have a specific number that we try to keep our families within, and that number is 26% of their gross monthly revenue should be allocated to housing, or less than that. Right. We have some families that go through the program and they're spending about 11% of their gross monthly income on housing. And what we've found is, especially working with a higher risk group than the subprime mortgage market, you would expect a higher level of default. National average for subprime is around 20%. We hover anywhere from 13 to 15% with a higher risk pool. And I think, the preparation, the sweat equity, the pride that goes into the program definitely help with that and keep families in their house long term. But that 26%, I think, is really the secret sauce. They're typically saving money coming from a high rent situation, sometimes as much as half.
Right. Well, they say that 11 million Americans are spending more than 50% of their monthly income on rent or housing. and in the majority of the cases, they are renters. So that, I mean, and that's really, you know, partly when you look at the issues really from the pandemic in the housing, what you saw is that this whole idea of affordability and really has, I mean, it's always been an issue, but it's come to the forefront. So I'm curious, when you think about housing, and you know, Andrew and I talked about that this 30% number, which is what the government does, is an arbitrary number that was just, you know, how they did it. So let's take a step back, and what I sort of want to, you know, when you look at all these other things that are related to it and everything, one of the questions I have is it, because what I felt like with the federal government and all these tax credits, and then there's these, I don't know, I called it the alphabet soup issues, that, you know, to jump through these loopholes, is part of the problem that the federal government is trying to fix a problem in a way that really should be fixed on the local level, because that community knows what kinds of issues or what types of residents they have or where they have opportunities. And I'm just wondering how you all feel this approach of having like Big Brother, you know, the federal, and then you got the state, and then you got local. How does that all play into, and is it receptive to thinking about all of these other things into the cost? So tell me, and then also with people, you know, fixed incomes, and, you know, I look at it now where everybody, they're raising the minimum wage to, okay, $15 an hour, but now we're talking about inflation and the cost of goods, and so now I'm like, wait a minute. So they're still behind the 8 ball because they still can't keep up. So I'm just wondering how you think about this role of, and because policy and zoning is so important to all of this. So what's your take on that, how, you know, the approach or trying to figure the problem out? I'll start with Andrew.
Oh gosh, I mean, there's a lot there. So hopefully I'll answer the question appropriately.
If not, I hope someone else will chime in and.
Yeah. So I look at it, you know, we're mostly tied to government funding. That's where I see it, not from like a policy standpoint or regulatory standpoint. Where we're building, they're zoned residential. I'm not really doing anything with rezoning properties. But the greatest, I guess, tie to the government is funding for us through either the state level at IHCDA or administered through City of Fort Wayne through block grants or home funds, what have you. And I will say it's absolutely necessary to gain access to those resources, especially if you were trying to build in areas where subsidy is necessary to get it done. You're not going to be the appraised value or the type of housing that you would need to build in that area to be attractive and desirable. You're going to be upside down on until the new market's created. Outside of that, you know, access to the resources, it's cumbersome. So there's a soft cost that's hard to calculate in terms of requesting the funds, so submitting that request, but then on the back end, making sure that you're validating and tracking things appropriately to demonstrate that you've allocated those resources in the manner in which they've requested you do so. So for me, it's a love-hate relationship. You got to go after the funds or you can't build, but then you're spending a ton of time managing those funds instead of building.
But isn't for you or for even anybody, isn't partly some of that not only from the federal, state, local level, how they allocate, but also then dealing with the banks? I mean, because they set they sort of set who they're going to give mortgages to, what kinds of percentage of interest they're going to charge. You know, doesn't that also play a role? And you're nodding your head, Heather, so what are you thinking?
No, you're exactly right. It's in a completely regulated industry. All partners are regulated. I mean, realtors, the lenders, the bankers, it's all regulated. And so appraisers play a huge role. And so to the extent that we ever, you know, I say when you drive down the street and you're looking at houses, do you ever think about, you know, we oftentimes in neighborhoods care about how housing gets financed, but if you really understood the whole industry, there's regulations everywhere.
But okay, but if it's so regulated, then why do we have such problems with institutionalized systemic racism of who can live where, or what kind of mortgage they're going to get, or redlining, or the type of mortgage. And why is that we have, if everything is so regular? I think it's also may all be regulated, but it is the most confusing to understand, and how this one works with that one and what the requirements are. But I'm wondering if it's so regulated. And then, I mean, this is where we need to take a step back, which historically, Zach, I think you could offer that, about the issue of with zoning issues and how they determined what they call multifamily and single-family home zoning. But let's look at that as, where are we breaking down here if everything is regulated?
I don't know. I don't know if there is ever a direct correlation between overregulation and simplified solutions. I don't think that's the issue.
What do you think the issue is?
They're complicated problems to solve. And your initial question about whether it should be federal or local, I think that's a common instinct. I also think that if you left these decisions to be made by local institutions or groups, you might see a larger disparity than you do now. You likely would.
For sure.
Why?
For sure.
I can't tell you how many times I have been in a public hearing to discuss the possibility of a low-income housing project, to torches and pitchforks held by people that qualify for that income level.
For sure.
Every community.
For sure.
Why? Okay, let's unpack this.
NIMBYism.
Yeah.
NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard.
Right.
But even the people who need the housing,
No one might not necessarily need it, but could qualify.
they don't want it in their backyard?
They don't want them,
Right.
Oh,
The unknown.
even though they are them.
Right.
And so a lot of this, I think, when it's done successfully, has a lot more to do with education than it does regulation.
okay.
Wow.
And who do we have to educate?
Every community.
Yes, and I do think, though, you mentioned systemic racism. The them is someone who doesn't look like me. And so there's a fear, an inherent fear, because who knows? However we were brought up, and what that face looks like to me when we define them. What I say or what you think of, what comes into your mind when I say housing, when I say affordable, when I say low income, defines everything about how you perceive your community.
Right.
Andrew worked in a really wonderful community, a neighborhood that's highly sought after.
Which
Values
neighborhood is that?
rising.
Williams Woodland in South Central Fort
Okay,
Wayne.
so you can speak to them, okay? So when you're out and talking to neighbors and working with them, do you hear this, that they're worried about who would come into their neighborhood, or
I mean, every neighborhood. I've been able to work in almost every neighborhood in Fort Wayne over the last 13 years, interacting deep relationally with neighbors, and it is true. It is a relational and a fear of the unknown, and I can know that there's a problem next door or for the next 10 doors, and ultimately desire and communicate that I want a solution for those. Yet, if I'm not part of the experience in describing or figuring out what that solution is, or have time to understand what the solution is, or meet some people and overcome it, then I will always default to saying no to the unknown rather than accepting that it could be good in faith that it will happen. And we've seen that, and to Zach and Heather's point, that is the other aspect in what they're describing here, is that neighborhoods are made up of people, and we have to look at human behavior, and we have to look at the individual challenges. That there are great ideas, there's great solutions, but maybe even more important is how you develop relationships and how strongly connected your neighborhood is to the solution being proposed ultimately drives the success in many projects. And so my experience as a neighbor in our neighborhood, we would have plenty of conversations about the lower income rental homes that seem to have more problems, and our desire to want to fix that and change it. And so the narrative could be, we just want it to go away. How do we collectively buy it? How do we solve the problem? How do we police it? Or how do we go the step further and start building relationships and trying to figure out how this can exist in our neighborhood for the sake of diversity in many different cases, and make it part of it. So it's a more active role, which is way more complicated. And that happens in every one of these things. We've seen good projects not succeed in predominantly white neighborhoods that are maybe older or middle income, not because they weren't great projects, but because they were not developed in relationship. And so it's designed for low-income artist housing and that thing, and it's the same demographic. So yet, because there's an unknown, it will be pushed back against harder than
and it wasn't my idea. You know, I think
Exactly.
you're exactly right. The grassroots effect is really powerful. If I think it's my idea and I get to have a hand in this beautiful design that, you know, someone who really gets great design, I mean, all of the rest of it kind of falls in place when I understand we need it and we designed it and we're going to drive this. I think that's the most powerful
Well,
group.
that's why I was wondering, I just felt the way that what it looks to me from the housing issue, it's a top down, that the federal government is saying, here's what you can do, here's the parameters, this is the type, this is, you know, what it has to do and everything. Instead of maybe, because again, in Fort Wayne or any city, you have to look at the average earning income of people, because if you create housing that they cannot afford, then you're not servicing that community. So what I was wondering is if maybe the grassroots, like, you know what buildings or what areas, there's buildings you could rehab, or there's places like that doesn't have old pipes, so you don't, or how they tore down houses. And so then you would create the programs and then you present them to the, like the checks and balance, and then you present them to the state or federal, and then they would approve it and oversee it, so you wouldn't have those biases.
In some programs you do.
You do. So what? So does that work? Is that better? Or is that?
I think it gets for a better don't you think? So like LIHTC's QAP,
What's that?
low-income housing tax credits qualified
Right.
allocation plan.
Right. See, this is like what I said. Like all of these, I called it alphabet soup.
Yeah.
in my language.
See,
Right.
you know what I meant.
Right.
That's a highly competitive process.
Yeah.
Every 2 years, they issue a new scoring list.
Okay.
So it, in theory, reflects current challenges, issues that they're seeing at the state level. And they're highly competitive, so, you know.
They're highly competitive because to provide the solution based on that.
Well, it's a score. So if your project, the design, scope, and management of that project, that potential project has to score well enough to get awarded. So you're competing against other projects throughout the state.
But wouldn't you have already applied for? You'd already had to get funding for the project, right?
No. That is the tool that you receive in the form of tax credits that can be sold for equity. And so, as Zach's saying, there is a process component to it that says you need to have engaged the community. But that process is the qualified allocation plan. Its primary customer base is going to be mostly developers,
Right.
who are going to be the ones that are, you know, taking the risk of investing. And it is highly complex, competitive, and very expensive
Right.
to do. They do their best to go in, they being developers, do their best to go into communities and try to collaborate and make that happen. But there is a deep chasm between that person who lives in the home in that nice neighborhood and the well-meaning developer who could build a very beautiful product. There's a big chasm between the two.
Okay, but I'm also going to push back that with the developers, because, you know, we sort of joke, and how I really became interested in housing is because I'm developing my own, what I called Project Wealth, which ultimately became Project Somewhat Wealth, because when I looked at anyone who has accrued significant wealth in this country, they have done it through real estate. And the large majority of them started in affordable housing. And I don't understand that, because I was like, well, how can they, if they have to build a house at a certain price and then they're going to sell it, how do they really make money doing this? And then you start looking at all these tax credits and all this other funding and how they can get support and everything. So I don't know. I mean, is it good that this affordable housing is it good that it's a for-profit developer, or should it be more nonprofits? I mean, you're limited by, last year you built 8 houses, despite even during pandemic. Yeah. So realistically, 8 houses a year, or 12, which is I think your goal, right? It's not going to solve the problem. Yeah. So I mean, I'm just saying, and then the other question I had when you mentioned about that the lower income home people that rent in those homes aren't as well kept, but that's not the fault of the person who lives in the house. That's because the 80% of the homes, like in Southeast, are rental. And when you look at who owns these houses, I mean, they found one group that's in New Zealand. So I would argue it's not because the person living in the house can't afford to take care of it. It's because the landlord isn't there, right?
Well, okay, but do you want this over or under-regulated?
I don't know. I'm asking you.
But either someone from New Zealand can buy a house, or you're going to add more regulation to something we've already defined as overcomplicated.
Okay, so do you think then that we should, that's what I'm asking, because do you think then that certain requirements or certain things should be on the local level? Like you told me about when we were talking about who owns these, and you said that there was a group that was coming in from somewhere and bought up, like, I don't remember, it was like over 50 houses, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a part of real estate development in our country now. It is a publicly traded industry to where there are investors, real estate developers, who are publicly traded on the NASDAQ or in the stock market, who have capital that will come in and buy large amounts of property. You couldn't buy it. There are developers who, it's the transfer of wealth that's happening in our country as well. Many family-owned businesses are selling at this place due to the age, and they're going to multinational companies, or it's just different. And real estate is part of that. And so there are people in our community who have accumulated 50, 100 properties, and they're hitting the age of retirement and where they don't want to deal with this anymore. And they don't want to piecemeal them out. And so there are investors and big companies that are coming into every city around the country and will have the capital to be able to offer $10 million, $50 million to acquire them all, and will
And then there's the
systemize
other
it.
issue, which I didn't realize, is that a lot of the housing that got the tax credits, it's like a 30-year time frame, and a lot of those are coming due now in the next 10 years. And so then they can take that up to market value. And so then they could, if they want to flip it and sell it, or so now we're outplacing people, because even a program we created to help people with subsidies is now coming due, and if we don't give them more subsidies, we're going to have another problem.
It's because we talk about housing as a solution for people, and we don't center the solutions around the people. I mean, when we're talking about low income, we're talking about poverty, which is a mindset, it's a way of life, and there's a lot more into the people, but it's easier to go ahead and transfer wealth back out to the wealthy than to address the wealth gap. And I think, then we get into the systems and the racism and all the terrible isms that exist.
And then also the issue of renters versus owners.
If
right?
I could afford to live anywhere I wanted to, it wouldn't matter, how scrupulous my landlord was. But unfortunately, I'm limited because of my income. And if that limitation on my income was only tied to market conditions and things like that, that'd be different. But there's a wealth gap that exists that's real, that puts us into a really precarious position as housing practitioners, I think.
Right. Well, they talk about so when they talk about what percentage of your household income goes to your housing, they talk about it as the burden, and it could be a severe burden. So they said nearly 9 in 10 renter households, so that's 88.5%, earn less than $20,000 annually, and that pay their rent. What they've also found is the raise of the rent every year outpaces the cost of living and earning. So when you talk about the burden and if they can afford it, so I mean, obviously this is a huge problem, and there's lots. And so I've got great minds here. So when you sort of sit or late at night, or when you're having a drink and you think to yourself, and all these things that that we haven't even scratched the surface on, because there's the construction costs now, and then there's the issues of the whole idea of the housing and ownership versus rentals and the homelessness. So when you're late at night and you're sort of really thinking, if I could do it or control the world issue in this, and you sort of think about what would you do? What would you offer? What do you say are your solutions? Where would you jump in? Zach? I know you've thought about this.
I think the biggest problem in this discussion is people oversimplify humans, especially in groups, instinct to be irrational and prejudiced to outsiders. You could have an infinite amount of tools at your discretion, and that's what I think of like the QAP program. I don't think that of as regulation.
What was the program?
That qualified allocation plan. I don't see that as regulation. I see it as a tool. If you don't want to use it, don't use it.
Right. Okay.
Building codes are regulations. I don't have a choice but to follow those.
Okay.
If you don't like the rules, don't play the game.
Okay, but the building codes is a big issue with zoning.
No.
No, that's different.
They're different.
Okay.
Zoning codes are rules communities have decided to impose on themselves.
Right.
If you don't like them, don't complain about it, change them. I can't change the building code.
Okay.
That's a lot more cumbersome.
Okay. And the building code, so that would indicate like why is that's not the idea that you can't build like a house in Fort Wayne that's a tiny house like under 900 square feet.
That'd be a
That's
zoning
not building
ordinance.
code.
That'd be a zoning ordinance.
That would be zoning.
Yeah.
So a building code would be like when I was looking at wanting to do 3D printing of like the bottom frame of the house, and then you would build the second floor. Like they're doing and testing. Would that be like being because there's no
That'd be a tough
rules to
one.
say if
Yeah.
I could 3D print my house or not. Is
Right.
that building?
Yeah, like if you want to do group homes versus 4-bedroom apartments, it changes the code and it
Okay.
changes the construction budget and whether or not the building has to be sprinkled and all that fun stuff. But that's not the same as a community who doesn't allow accessible dwelling units on properties
Right.
and then at the same time complains that they don't have apartments for people to live in.
Right.
Those are rules you've imposed on yourself.
Okay.
So to your real question, I don't know what I would do because I think the last thing you do, especially within the context of this discussion, is operate in a way that assumes people need fixed. And too often in these discussions, that's precisely what people are doing, especially quote unquote experts. And the second that people realize that's what the attempt is, it usually ends in catastrophe.
Okay, but we're not. But the harsh facts are, we are in a housing crisis. Okay, for lots of reasons. I mean, and some of them we've outlined. So
I don't know what that means.
Right.
well, first of all, they're saying that we are not building enough housing for demand in the next 10 years. We are behind. We need.
Depends on whose population growth charts you read.
Okay. There's also the issues of the types of housing we're building. Does that fit the demographics that we're having, right?
It's upside down to current preferences.
Right. Okay.
Totally.
So, all right.
Today's preferences.
Right. Okay. So, and then we know that people can't afford their rent, or they can't afford to buy a home, or people don't want them in their neighborhood, right? We know these are problems, right?
Which may be a housing issue or a salary issue.
Right, which is what I started, that there were so many issues we needed to unpack.
Right.
But you guys are in this every day,
Yeah.
okay? And you're providing solutions. So you have to admit that, how do you go about then when you're trying to build something or deal with the neighborhood or where you're going to create, how do you not say that you are trying to solve a problem or fix something? Is that not what you're doing? Or is that fundamentally what's wrong with this? I don't know.
I think saying that housing is the problem is the wrong place to begin.
Okay, so where should we begin?
Well, when you say that there's a crisis, a housing crisis, it actually to me means that there are people who need housing that aren't finding it. So is that a lack of housing stock? Or is that a lack of affordable housing stock to that population?
Okay.
And our motivation to address that. But then when you really tie it to the people issue, I'm going to keep saying it goes back to wealth. It goes back to we have generation after generation after generation of families who thought their only option is to live in rental housing that's at best precarious. And then we have a global pandemic that proves to us how inflexible our housing system is.
Right, because also what we're facing now is the ending of the moratorium on evictions, and the prediction is that there's so many renters who are behind in their rent, and then we're also losing, that additional government money, and then also the people who were getting the emergency rental assistance that they just is not getting out to people. So you've got those problems as well.
But if you want to go and address, let's take the easier route.
Okay.
Let's leave people here and let's look at housing as a problem, community by community.
Okay.
So Northeast Indiana measured the 10 counties around Allen County a couple of years ago and found we need 15,000 housing units added. And as Zach said, exactly the truth, that the population who lives here today in our makeup now is exactly the opposite of the people who are trying to live here.
Right.
And if you look at millennials, who are the people who want to live here, let's say 70, maybe 80%, most of them do not believe they can afford a home. Have student debt that precludes them from buying a home oftentimes. And so when you're looking at a housing solution for that group, what it looks like for those 10 counties around Allen County is that we need more rental. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, affordable rental housing is what the narrative becomes, big A.
Okay, which creates
because most millennials are 60% AMI or so around.
What is AMI?
So 60% of area median income. So that means if the average person makes $80,000 a year, these individuals are making 60% of that.
Okay.
So I think our median income is somewhere around 60,000. Mm-hmm. So 48,000 for that millennial.
When I looked up for Fort Wayne, I wanted to know what percentage of our population has an income over 50,000, and it's not very high. I mean, the majority of our population has less.
It's household, right?
Right, that's household.
It's not individual.
Right. Yeah. No, but when you talk about the type of housing that what's changing is also the fastest growing segment of housing is for people singles.
Right.
And
right.
Not at any age. So they have different demands or housing. And then you look at people, also they were talking about what the needs are. So each population has different needs because the veterans have different needs, and then at-risk populations have different needs. And everybody.
If you design your housing solution around that group of people,
okay,
you start to get to some solutions as it relates to how a local community can take action and address their own local housing market.
So when you look at for Habitat, do you have a specific demographic or people? Are there requirements or you say this is who we're targeting, like families or single mothers or?
It's just what Heather said. We're looking for 30% to 80% average median income.
Okay.
So we're looking for families with stable jobs that can afford to purchase a house at 0%.
Okay.
And that it doesn't matter if you're a single person or you're a family with multiple children.
Right.
Single parent households. It's really inconsequential to who can afford the product that we're building.
And if they state that the poverty level for a single person is people who make less than $12,000 a year, okay? That's right. I was like, how could you afford? You can't afford anything. I mean, and then the average household is under 20 for a family of four. I think it's under 25,000 a year. I think it's the level of that's poverty level, based on that's from the federal government. So, I mean, I know this is a big issue, but I really want to get back to, and I mean, I had Zach when I do this exercise about if he could create downtown, what it would look like. So I understand you keep coming back and you're pushing, well, this problem or that problem, but come on, you guys are out there every day trying to figure it out. So what are you doing? I mean, are you saying you're only focusing on, so you've decided you're focusing based on income? Right?
Well, I haven't decided.
No,
Habitat International decided for me, and I just play by those rules. So that.
And do you think that that's fair? That it should be that way?
Well, the model is based on ability to pay.
Okay.
So by our very nature, we're not trying to address homelessness. That's not our population.
Okay.
And that is a gift. That is a functional part of a housing system that's very complex.
Right.
And
is
so
the homelessness problem?
When you look at the spectrum of homelessness to full on, all of us are on that spectrum.
Right.
Even if you need nothing, you're still participating.
Right.
If you got an FHA loan,
FHA is the
federal. This is basically it's
the mortgage.
A backed mortgage. It's a subsidized mortgage that a lot of people get.
Right. Well, and the truth is, the reason that the government had to create the subsidized mortgage is because the reality is most people wouldn't have been able to buy a home in the first place without it.
But you can't see an FHA mortgage plastered on the front of a house when you drive down the street. Yet it is subsidized
wait,
housing.
I don't understand. Isn't everybody's mortgage, like when I go to the bank and I apply for a mortgage, right? Isn't that Fannie and Freddie, isn't that who's?
Not always. They're conventional mortgages.
So for most people, don't get a Freddie and Freddie.
FHA.
My first house is FHA.
Mine was FHA. I even had the MCC tax credit,
And
which
what
is
isn't it? Okay,
for
hold on.
first-time
Wait,
homebuyers
wait.
who are low income.
Okay, so that's okay. So wait a minute.
there are all these tools. All I'm saying is there's just a certain segment of the population that gets labeled as being in affordable housing. But my point is, if you received an FHA mortgage, and some of us here, our first mortgage was, then you received a federal subsidy, and
Right.
you were therefore in affordable housing.
Okay, but why is that bad? Didn't we have a GI Bill?
Well,
wasn't the GI Bill? Didn't that help everybody get houses in Levittown?
It's not.
No.
No, that didn't. They still
Help
have
some people.
Okay, the GI, right? The veterans, right?
Well, if with the right skin color.
So they're okay.
I mean, none of this is that simple.
Okay. And then I want to lay another layer of complexity to this, which I really thought about. And I compared they talked about the greater fool theory. And in art, like when you see a painting and you see it being auctioned off for $30 million or $50 million, it's sort of based on what the market will bear, right? It's sort of like what somebody evaluates it at. Well, that's the same thing a little bit with housing. We all build into this idea that our houses have value and that they are worth something. But in reality, it's really based on what somebody is willing to pay for that house, right? I mean, we all sort of believe in it. And then the other thing I didn't understand is when you look at property values and assessment, and I was like, well, that's a government entity. And so they have it's sort of in their favor to increase property value because then they get more money in property taxes, which means when they say they're not going to raise our taxes in other areas, all of a sudden, and I was talking to somebody and he was like, his house in Fort Wayne in a year was appraised at $30,000 more. And he's like, oh, my house is worth so much. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, is it really? Like, so I don't.
Well, there again, we have another complexity.
But that's what I'm saying. I'm now putting another layer.
If you've got more money coming in, but your bill stays, your expenses stay the same, we all sort of pay less. So the government system of how taxes play in, it's not like the government just gets to keep taking more and more taxes. There's a budget that goes along with that, right? And so if there's more value, in theory, our tax rate could go down.
Okay.
Okay.
So it's not okay.
So it's not like, yeah, and so, but back to the housing side of things.
But aren't we all just basically, it's based on like this whole crazy market now where people are bidding,
Okay, but again, if you have a mortgage involved. Now,
Okay.
cash buyers,
That's different. Okay.
that's way different.
All right.
If I've got the ability to buy a house cash, that's why I go back to wealth. If I've got cash, even if I'm taking out a second mortgage or an equity loan on my
Right.
house, if I go buy a house cash, I basically absolve myself of a lot of other opportunities for people to make that impossible for me. So the more I'm able to be able to have enough wealth to buy it on my own, and I don't need the system that makes mortgages, I'm better off in that way. And so back to your point of a willing buyer and a willing seller, that's just not the truth. The truth is there's someone who comes into the middle of that when you have a mortgage, and it's called an appraiser. And I want to liken it to Van Gogh. If I paint the exact same picture of a Van Gogh painting, it looks exactly the same, but I put my name on it, and you've got a Van Gogh, who's this going to go for more money? Who do you think?
Well,
The Van
because
Gogh.
Van Gogh, because
Right. Okay, well, the
But that's
same
not
goes
based
for
on-
if Zach sells a house. I can tell you there's some examples of this right now. And I sell a house and I leave all of my family's pictures in my house, and I show up and that appraiser comes and looks at me and sees that I'm selling, and Zach goes to the exact same, comes to my house and sells it for me. He's the Van Gogh. I'll just give it away.
and that's because of the color of your skin? Or is that, or just
I'm just saying that the fair housing folks in
Yes.
Indiana are dealing
No.
with this.
Yes. There's cases. There's there's a huge litany of examples where that is true.
And isn't that the issue that you also have, though, when you're building, because we talked about when you're building a house and how much it costs to build that house and then what you can get that house appraised for?
Well, yeah, but it's where we choose to build because land is accessible and
Okay.
infrastructure is in place, but it's typically low-income census tracts with lower appraised values and houses that are in worse shape.
Right.
So
But isn't also part of the problem, though, is how appraises, this is what I didn't understand, like in Southeast, when you're going to appraise a house, or like you just sold your house, so the appraisal, it's based on what other things in the area go for or what they're built at.
Or as we saw in Renaissance Point years ago, they'll
Okay.
take it out of the land if they think that, wow, this is just worth too much. And that was...
What do you mean they said it was, what was
There
worth too much?
there were appraisals completed, and they literally took money, made the land worth a negative value in order to get the price to where it should be for that market. And when we challenged that, it was actually a builder here in Fort Wayne who said, absolutely not, we're not accepting that, requested a review appraisal. The appraiser came out of Indianapolis up and actually proved that the builder was right.
See, I think, that's what I meant about the conflict with the appraisal. I think that it shouldn't be, the appraisal office should not be a department of the city. I think it should be an independent.
They're not.
They're not?
They're not. The people who assess taxes are different from the private sector bank partners called
No,
appraisers.
but the people who assess, they still work for the city, right? No.
Appraisals don't.
They don't. Okay, so they're independent. So what did you find in this whole appraisal issue and selling your house and, you know?
It's complicated. It's as nuanced and unknown as everyone here has described and experienced. So yes, we just sold a house in a historic neighborhood that you look at the socioeconomics of that geographic area, and it's, you know, tax appraised at one price, which is significantly lower than what we even listed the house and then what we sold the house for. And then there's this whole mix between what the person offered us and where the appraisal came in, with an appraisal gap that is now common in housing.
What is an appraisal gap?
So because we have such a competitive housing market, when a buyer wants to buy a house, they have to get creative, and it's part of the contract to where they will make an offer on the house over your sale price in this particular case, with the anticipation that the appraisal will come in lower than what they are offering, and so they decide to use cash that they have on the back end and say, we will give you X dollars to cover any appraisal gap. So here's what we offered you, here's where the appraisal could come in, and if there's a gap, we will use cash to cover it as far as we can.
But why would they want to do that?
It's competitive.
Because
They understand that
But
if they do not, they could lose a house where somebody did not offer that.
Yeah, but the
because
same point to
appraisal's
me is,
coming.
isn't this what we're creating? Is this bubble again? Because isn't this what we're getting? Is people are going to get these?
No. The fact that appraisers are choosing to take value, I mean, when you, like you said, simple economics, I'm willing to pay X and you're willing to accept X, we should be able to trade on that. We don't trade on that. The mortgage company or the lender has to come into play with the appraiser who says, we've got to protect this mortgage company, the bank's risk. Therefore, we will not, recommend that they approve a loan over Y. Now, we either have no deal and, Andrew gets less.
Right.
Because that's what was happening before we had a hot market here, was that price came down. Now we were basically...
You used to use the low appraisal to negotiate a lower sell price.
Sale
Right.
price.
But I mean, again, maybe I'm missing something, but I would use the appraisal price as what I'm willing to pay for the house.
And by
And you
doing
wouldn't buy a
that-
house this year.
Exactly.
No, I know I wouldn't buy a house this year, but what I'm saying is, this is where I mean, it's the greater fool, because you believe just because someone says that wants $300,000 for their house, but the appraiser says it's only worth $200,000. Shouldn't I go with what the appraiser is telling me? Then just because Andrew thinks his house is
don't want
worth
the
I get to be really frustrated because we lost money because what the buyer was willing to pay us for this
then you don't
house.
have to sell it to me.
But
if you want.
the point is, in this
Yeah.
market, you really want this
Right.
house, and more importantly to this conversation, you have the cash to put on the table to make it happen, which further exacerbates the wealth issue.
Right. Yeah.
If I wasn't able to make that house mine before, because maybe someone's not willing to make me a loan,
Or even the amount, even besides this whole appraisal gap thing, is the percentage that you have to be able to put down now, right? Like, even.
Well, the problem goes away if you can pay cash.
No, but
Exactly.
I'm
We
just
all
saying,
just had
but I'm
one.
always saying that to get a better mortgage rate and everything, it's all about how much you can put down.
again, yes, it's all slanted.
And Sarah, I think where the appraisal conversation comes in is we live in a technically low-income neighborhood that is emerging and is developing like many historic neighborhoods are in Fort Wayne in the
Okay.
downtown area. My wife and I and our family, we were very privileged to be able to buy a house, fix it up, be able to sell it and benefit from this.
Right.
Where this becomes a problem in the context of the original conversation of affordable housing, our house has appreciated, say, $80,000 in the last 18 months, making it nearly impossible for those who have a lower income to benefit from the same neighborhood values and proximity that others could. So that it eliminates the challenge of this. It eliminates opportunities for others who could benefit from the type of neighborhood that we've lived in, and or in many cases, for some that are older and thinking towards the next phase of life, this benefits them, low-income people,
Right.
because now they've got all this extra equity that if they're ready to leave, they will benefit and they will make the choice and leave and never look back and think about their affordable.
Okay, but that creates
account.
several problems. One is, like, you could sell your house, but you can't afford to buy anything, so where are you gonna go?
Well,
Baby
yes,
boomers,
for us,
no,
it doesn't
no,
matter.
not- baby boomers are aging in place, so they want to stay in their homes. But what I don't understand about this now, okay, how can did you put on a second story? Did you put in a pool? What gave it? Nothing changed. What gave it a value of $80,000 more in 18 months? To me, that is crazy, and there is something wrong with the system. There's no way that your house could
What system?
Right.
of creating what this house.
No, that's the point. There is
Okay.
no system. We're talking about this like free market capitalism is rational. It's not. It's not a system. I have no idea why my truck's worth what it is. I know what I get for it on the market. And if it was a different truck, I would get more.
Which is higher now than it was 6, 8, 10 months
Yeah.
ago. And it will be
Although-
lower.
Does that make sense to me? No.
So, but I think, okay, so I think that as we come to the close of this first part, I think what you really just hit on is we can't assume that any of this is rational. It's not. I mean, and trying to, maybe it's, I'm trying to understand something rationally that actually there's so much involved that's not.
People are moving, supply and demand. If we want our region to grow like we have been investing in for the last 10, 15, 30 years, supply and demand and available, accessible, move-in, ready housing is in short supply, which we've established, which
Right.
drives prices up. And so people, like the people that bought our house, are in from out of town.
Right.
They've missed out on trying to buy 17 different houses
Yeah.
before they
Well,
were able
but-
to land on a particular deal.
But to your credit, that's not the same neighborhood you moved into.
Right.
Absolutely.
And it's not just because of bricks and mortar.
And the house,
It's the people.
Exactly.
That goes
Yeah.
back to our
Yeah.
people. And then what they're
But there's a-
investing, and then also,
80 grand of that, a portion of that monetary value
people.
is the people.
and also because what you're also doing is when you help your neighbors keep their upkeep or their lawn and fix their stuff,
Absolutely.
that help bring, it's like all boats
Yeah,
float,
because it's
right?
the people. We made choices to care for one another, and that adds value, especially in an area where on the fringes, people may not want to live.
Okay,
In a
so I
neighborhood
think-
that by and large didn't have that when you moved in.
Okay, so I think in the first part of this, we did really well. We have come full circle to say this is not necessarily rational, and so maybe how we think about housing and all the issues, and maybe there isn't an issue, crisis, I don't know. And it goes back to it's about the people. Okay, so I think we did really well in that kind of circle. But so as you know, at the end of each And Good Company program, I usually ask guest questions that French novelist Marcel Proust popularized from a Victorian parlor game. But since Zach Benedict, this is his 4th time at this table, I have to change the format a little bit and the questions. So what I'm going to do is they're called Would You Rather questions, but it's still another really great way to get to know people better, and they're really designed to make you think. So, Andrew, Gritsmaker, would you rather have the ability to see 10 minutes into the future or 10 minutes into the future or 150 years into the future?
10 minutes. I want to see the bus coming.
Okay. Zach, would you rather have telekinesis, the ability to move things with your mind, or telepathy, the ability to read minds?
Telekinesis.
Why?
I don't want to know what people are thinking.
Okay. Heather, would you rather team up with Wonder Woman or Captain Marvel?
Oh, Wonder Woman.
Why?
She's a girl, and I think that, she did some really cool things, and I like her outfit.
It's those bracelets.
It is the bracelets.
Andrew, would you rather find true love today or win the lottery next year?
True love today.
Okay. Andrew, I'm going to go back this way. Would you rather be in jail for 5 years or be in a coma for a decade?
Maybe a coma.
Okay. Heather, would you rather have another 10 years with your partner or a one-night stand with your celebrity crush?
Oh, definitely the 10 years with my partner.
They're recording.
And I know that you're all and I know that you're all thinking your own would you rathers for each of these. Okay, Zach, would you rather have everyone you know be able to read your thoughts or for everyone you know to have access to your internet history?
Oh,
they can read my thoughts. They can do that now.
This is so funny.
Andrew, would you rather lose your sight or your memories?
Sight.
Zach, would you rather have universal respect or unlimited power?
Universal respect.
Okay. Heather, would you rather stay in during a snow day or build a fort?
Oh. The right answer is to build a fort, but I'd want to stay in.
There's no right answer.
I know, I'm thinking on my
Okay,
people.
Andrew, would you rather be 11 feet tall or 9 inches tall?
Oh, 11 feet.
Okay. Andrew, would you rather solve world hunger or global warming?
World hunger.
Okay. Heather, would you rather live in a treehouse or in a cave?
Treehouse.
Okay. Zach, would you rather win $25,000 or your best friend win $100,000?
Best friend won 100.
And Andrew, would you rather have a photographic memory or an IQ of 200?
Photographic memory.
Okay. Well, I think we have learned a great deal about you. And like I said, I think we have not even scratched the surface of any issue with around housing, only to realize that it is a significant problem, or not a problem. I don't know. What would you define it as if it's not a problem, Zach? What would you say? It's a
crisis of deficient leadership at the local level.
Okay, which actually will be great because that will tie in to part 2 of this conversation, which we are going to focus on Fort Wayne and Northeast Indiana and hone in there. So thank you very much for part 1. And you can learn more about And Good Company and all the other great conversations we have had at andgoodcompany.info. And you can look forward to part 2 of our conversation, taking a look at housing with these really innovative thought leaders and experts in the field.